unfathomable mystery of life. Snow is the symbol of cold, destructive force called death. And death is a very basic symbol in almost every poem of Robert Frost. Seemingly, the speaker seems to be standing in the woods. On another level, he is caught in a moment of time, arresting all his powers to find an answer to the mystery of life. But he is unable to find the answers to his questions. Seemingly, we can find that the poet is standing in the woods near a village, and there is a house there, and this is a snowy evening, and snow is falling. This is the atmosphere of the poem, and it seems to be very simple. But it is not as simple as it seems to be. Let's move ahead. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. The word queer is very important. It means strange. Here we can see that the companion of the poet, which is horse, he seems to be thinking it very queer that why did we stop here when there is no any farmhouse near? Why we are standing here among the frozen woods, and why we are standing here without any purpose in such an evening, such dark evening of the year. In the second stanza, poet introduces a foil. The horse here symbolizes rustic common sense. Again, there is a symbol. And this rustic common sense sans any feelings and emotions. It is a horse that sets us thinking as to why the man stopped there in the midst of the jungle, far from the essentials human life, and to top it all on an evening which is the darkest evening of the year. Next line, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Now imagine the atmosphere of the poem where there is no any human being or any other object nearby. And in this stanza 2, the question aroused by the horse is an evidence of a sort of telepathy between the speaker and his horse, which would not have been possible without perfect mutual understanding between the two. As the rider stops there, immediately the horse shakes his head to confirm that why did we stop here. This is a kind of telepathy between the two, rider and the horse. Horse seems to ask if there is anything wrong. What are we waiting for? Quite obviously, the horse has become a symbol too, without losing his identity as a horse. Means that here in these lines, and even in the previous lines, the horse has become a symbol as well as an entity without losing its identity as a horse. Let's move ahead. The words are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Very important. These last two lines, these are very important. And in most of Frost's poem, we can observe such kind of repetition of lines and repetition of words, which is a hallmark of his poetry. In these these lines, the speaker is of the view that the words are very lovely, dark, and deep. The mood of the poet and his fancy seem to get entangled in the words that are lovely, dark, and deep. The poet is a man of world. He has to go on his defined path, and as his obligations to tend before he can yield to spontaneous, natural, passionate calls of nature. He has miles to go before he can sleep. He repeats this thought and the poem ends with the end of the performance. The repetition of the line and miles to go before I sleep is poignantly symbolic. There can be little doubt that the primary meaning is I have a long way to go before I get to bed tonight. Or the second time he says it, however, miles to go and sleep are suddenly transformed into symbols. Miles to go perhaps assumes the dimension of the tedious, seemingly unending journey of life, and sleep symbolizes the final sleep, means death. This is the most important and most variedly interpreted of all the stanzas of the poem. Means in the last stanza, the poet is using the word sleep again and again, and we can gather from the whole poem and the imagery and the symbolism used in the poem that the poet is referring the sleep towards the death. And this image, this symbol is a recurrent image in his poetry. For more questions, if you want to ask any questions further about this poem, you may ask me in the comment box, and wait for the next video. I will come with some other poems of Robert Frost, because I have started a series of Robert Frost poems, and we will try to discuss the most important and most famous poems of Robert Frost.
Magical Cream Mala now. Big Freeze Rio Over Magic. Magical Cream Cube Double Treat.
This is the urban jungle, where the engine must survive all extremes, from smooth highways to rough dirt and gravel. Your engine must perform on unpredictable road conditions.
In 3 words, I can sum up everything I have learned about life. It goes on. These are the words said by Robert Frost. President Kennedy called Robert Frost the great American poet of our time. Adlai Stevenson, who was an American politician, paid him the following tribute. In Robert Frost, the American people have found their singer, their seer, in short, their bard. When Frost was only 11 years old, his father died of tuberculosis at the age of 34, and Frost's freedom came to an end. There was a streak of desperation in his inheritance. There had been causes of insanity and suicide in his family. The poet himself had to struggle to overcome depressive and suicidal elements in his makeup. When he was 19 years old, his first professional poem was accepted by a magazine, and he received payment of $15. Frost was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for poetry 4 times, being the only poet ever to achieve this 4-fold distinction. Besides, he was awarded many honorary degrees by colleges and universities. Most of the 88 years of Frost's life have been devoted to poetry. Frost loved the earth and its ways. Frost will ever be recognized for his unique, mystical, and uncanny poetry. He died in January 1963 after a major surgical operation at the age of 88. Hence, he had spent a life full of amazement and full of zeal and zest. In the upcoming videos, I would like to explain most of his famous poems one by one with the critical appreciation and full explanation of the text. So wait for the next videos and stay tuned to my channel. Thank you so much. This video is dedicated to all those sisters who love their brothers to an extreme extent. Because this is the story of the two siblings, Maggie and Tom. Hello and Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome back to my channel and I am Mehreen. The Mill on the Floss is a Victorian novel written by George Eliot in 1860. George Eliot was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. Mill on the Floss is an autobiographical novel, and in Maggie we get an account of the author's own complex personality. George Eliot is, of course, the first sociological novelist as well as psychological novelist. The novel begins with a description of the town of St. Ogg's and the river Floss, on whose banks it is situated. Everybody in this tale is repelling everybody, and life is in it the strictest sense a battle. Principal characters of the novel are Mr. Tulliver, owner of the mill on the Floss. Mrs. Tulliver is, of course, his wife. Tom Tulliver is their only son. Maggie Tulliver, she is their daughter. Aunt Glegg, Aunt Dean, and Aunt Pullet. These are the sisters of Mrs. Tulliver, and they are very rich, and they time to time criticize the ways and the manners of their sister's home. Philip Wakeham is Maggie's suitor, and he is a disabled person. Lucy Dean, she is the cousin of Tom and Maggie. And Stephen Guest, a very important character, he is Lucy's fiancé. Dorlcote Mill stood on the banks of the river Floss near the village of St. Ogg's. This mill is owned by the ambitious Mr. Tulliver.
पाकिस्तान में हर दो में से एक बच्ची तालीम से महरूम है। एक मजबूत माँ ये बदल सकती है। आए सराहें उन माँओं को जो
It provided a good living for him and his family, but he dreamed of the day when his son Tom would climb to a higher station in life. Mrs. Tulliver's sisters, who had married well, criticized Mr. Tulliver's unseemly ambition and openly predicted the day when his air castles would bring himself and his family to ruin. Aunt Glegg, richest of the sisters, held the note on his property, and when he quarreled with her over his plans for Tom's education, Mr. Tulliver determined to borrow the money and repay her. For Tom, who had inherited the placid arrogance of his mother's people, life was not difficult. His sister Maggie grew up with an imagination beyond her years of understanding. But Tom's troubles began when his father sent him to study at Mr. Stalling's school. Having little interest in spelling, grammar, or Latin, Tom found himself wishing he were back to the mill, and where he might dream of someday riding a horse like his father's and giving orders to people around him. Mr. Starling was convinced that Tom was not only obstinate but also stupid. Returning home for Christmas holidays, Tom learned that Philip Wickham, son of a lawyer who was his father's enemy, would also enter Mr. Starling's school. Philip Wickham was a crippled, disabled person, and so Tom was not able to beat him up as he should have liked to at first. Philip could draw and he knew Latin and Greek. After they overcame their initial reserve, the two boys became useful to one another. Philip admired Tom's arrogance and self-possession, and Tom needed Philip's knowledge to help him in his studies. But their father's quarrel kept a breach between them. And this breach remained throughout their life. Tom felt that Philip was needed to be washed and that he was the son of a rascal. Here, I want to make it clear that Mrs. Stilling was not like a conventional school as we take it to be. It was a kind of hostel where some selective students live at Mr. Starling's lodging, where Mr. Starling is the only teacher who teaches them Latin, grammar, spellings, and other little art to master. It is a kind of a very expensive mode of education, and unfortunately, Mr. Tulliver has borrowed money for this education from his sister-in-law. It will ultimately become a burden on family, and Mr. Tulliver will be entangled in the whirl of this misfortune. When Maggie came to visit Tom, she met Philip, and the two became close friends because Maggie has a very compassionate heart for the rejected people, especially the people who are rejected by society. And we know Philip was crippled. That is why he has already made a soft corner in Maggie's heart. Then, after Maggie had been sent away to school with her cousin Lucy, Mr. Tulliver became involved in lawsuit because Mr. Wickham, the father of Mr. Philip, defended the opposition. Mr. Tulliver said his children should have as little as possible to do with Philip. Unluckily, Mr. Tulliver lost his suit and stood to lose all his property as well. In order to pay off Aunt Glegg, he had borrowed money on his household furnishings. Now he hoped Aunt Pullet would lend him the money to pay the debt against which his household goods stood forfeit. He could no longer afford to keep Maggie and Tom in school. Then Mr. Tulliver learned that Mr. Wickham had bought up his debts. And the discovery brought on a stroke. Tom made Maggie promise never to speak to Philip Wickham again. Mrs. Tulliver wept because her household things were to be put at auction. In the reunion which followed, Tom and Maggie rejected the scornful offers of help from their aunts. Then, of course, Tom had to do something for his family. Tom took a job in a warehouse and studied bookkeeping each night. Mr. Wickham, the father of Philip, bought the mill but permitted Mr. Tulliver to act as its manager for wages. Now everyone can imagine how much this is difficult to be an employee where yesterday you were the manager.
क्या करूं यार, सुहेब हर वक्त रैंकी और अनकंफर्टेबल रहता है।
डायपर बदलो।
ये सारा प्रॉब्लम रैशेस और अनकंफर्टेबल डायपर्स का है।
इसको रॉकेट डायपर पहनाओ, तुम और सुहेब दोनों खुश रहोगे।
रॉकेट डायपर्स, सुपर मॉम्स की फर्स्ट चॉइस।
It was Wickham's plan eventually to turn the mill over to his son. Tulliver, not knowing what else to do, stayed on as an employee of his enemy. But he asked Tom to sign the statement in Bible that he would wish the Wickham's evil as long as he lived. Against Maggie's entreaties, Tom signed it. We know that Maggie had a soft corner for Philip. He got some money which he invested with Bob Jenkins, who was his childhood friend. Slowly, Tom began to accumulate funds to pay off his father's debts. Time passes swiftly, and the golden gates of childhood had been shut on Maggie and Tom. Maggie is now 17 years of age. One day, Philip accompanies his father to the mill. Maggie avoids meeting Philip in the presence of their fathers. She is leading the life of a recluse, having sacrificed most of her pleasures, but she remembers Philip and his deformity and would like to say a few kind words to him. Maggie takes her daily walk in the Red Deeps. This is a secluded place with soothing sounds and beauty which she has grown to love. While there one day she meets Philip, who admits having followed her there in the hope of meeting her. Then it became frequent that Philip used to come to Red Deeps to meet Maggie. One day he asked Maggie if she loved him. She put him off. Later, at a family gathering, she betrayed her feeling for Philip in a manner which aroused Tom's suspicions. He made her swear on the Bible not to have anything more to do with Philip. And then he sought out Philip and ordered him to stay away from his sister. In the result of all this conversation, she meets Philip and tells him why they cannot meet again. Philip declares that he will remain steadfast and also calls Tom narrow-minded. As we know that Tom had some suspicion about Philip and Maggie, and one day he was also following Maggie, and he found Philip and Maggie, both of them meeting at Red Deeps. Tom arrives Red Deeps while following Maggie, and there a scene is created. Tom insults Philip and refers mockingly to his deformity. He threatened to trash Philip if he ever tried to meet Maggie again. He then drags Maggie away with him. This is a very typical kind of brother. After this incident, 3 weeks pass. Tom has now made plenty of money, enough to pay off the creditors. He has accomplished this through hard work and the export transactions suggested by his childhood friend Bob Jenkins. Mr. Tulliver is elated at the prospect. It is a very happy day when Mr. Tulliver and his son go to meet the creditors at an inn in the town to pay off all the debts. Tulliver gives a speech and praises his son. He rides home excited and happy as he is now a free man. When he nears the gates of Dorlcote Mill, he sees Wakeham on his horse. Wakeham criticizes Tulliver's method of work. Tulliver loses his temper, pushes the lawyer down from his horse and starts flogging him. Maggie rushes and stops her father on hearing Wakeham screaming for help. Wakeham rides away after threatening legal action against Tulliver. The excitement and rage prove so much for Tulliver, and he suffers a stroke. He realizes that his end is near. He tells Tom to look after his mother and his sister and also to get the mill back. He dies soon after murmuring that the world is too much for him. Tom and Maggie cling together and they weep. 2 more years pass. Now Maggie has been working in a school since her father's death. She gets an invitation from her cousin Lucy Dean to spend some days with her. Now, a very crucial twist in Maggie's life is about to come. Maggie's mother is already at Dean's place as a housekeeper, for Mrs. Dean has died. You know, Mrs. Dean was the mother of Lucy and she was the sister of Mrs. Tulliver. Lucy is being courted by Stephen Guest, a handsome young man and son of a senior partner of Guest and Co. The Guests want Stephen to marry elsewhere, but he is quite firm in his resolve of marrying Lucy. Lucy is worried about whether Maggie will like the frequent visits of Philip, who is also a mutual friend of Lucy and Stephen. She decides to tell Philip not to come over for some days while she would consult Maggie when she comes. Stephen makes some mocking remarks about the Tulliver and Maggie, whom he has never seen. When Lucy mentions her cousin's forthcoming visit, but Lucy defends her aunt and cousins, however, she does not enlighten Stephen about Maggie's good looks and intellect, hoping to enjoy his discomfiture when he meets her. Maybe she wanted to give him a surprise. When Maggie arrives, she and Lucy settle down to a confidential chat. Lucy tells Maggie about being courted by Stephen Guest. Lucy is very anxious that Maggie should be amused after her dull life at school. She tells Maggie that Philip and Stephen visit the house constantly. Maggie just starts at the mention of Philip. Stephen is astonished to see Maggie. Hello and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to my channel. Today I have come back with the most awaited second and last part of Maggie's story, The Mill on the Floss. If you want to enjoy the first part, link has been dropped in the description box. Please visit it. Maggie's life has reached to a turning point as she is about to meet Stephen, the fiancé of Lucy. Series of misfortunate incidents is about to start in Maggie's life. Stephen is astonished on meeting Maggie to note her beauty and is attracted towards her. Maggie is instinctively aware that Stephen is attracted towards her, and everybody knows that this is the instinct of every girl, that she can understand what kind of attraction the opposite person is having for her. They all go rowing. While stepping out of the boat, Maggie stumbles and Stephen helps her. Oh my god, what a typical filmy scene is there. She is thrilled at Stephen's touch and the attention from his strong, handsome man. The evening incidents have left her highly strung and deeply affected. She is disturbed by new emotions. She is aware that she has the power to attract men and she has enjoyed Stephen's admiration. When Lucy comes in and asks for her opinion of Stephen, she tells Lucy that he's too self-confident. Talking of Philip, Maggie tells Lucy that she cannot meet him without Tom's permission, though she wants to meet Philip. Maggie tells the whole story about herself and Philip. Lucy says that she will find some way out and insists that Maggie should meet Philip. She hopes that Maggie and Philip will one day get married. Here, Lucy is revealed to be an essentially affectionate and good-natured but simple girl, not possessing the complex mind of Maggie. After a few days, Maggie goes to meet Tom at his lodgings. When Maggie asks Tom about meeting Philip, Tom first objects. He makes it clear that she will have to give up her brother if she wants Philip. Can you feel some desi vibes in these emotions? He tells, however, that she is not to take Philip as a suitor. Maggie tells Tom to come over to Glegg's the next day. where she and Lucy would also go to tea. Tom declines. Maggie proves to be good to her words. She still loves her brother, but Tom is unable to understand Maggie and sincerely feels that her spirit of independence will land her in trouble. George Eliot's psychological insight into human nature is once again evident in these scenes. Tom has been making business trips for his film. Maggie has been introduced to high society by her cousin Lucy. Maggie finds a new life quite pleasant and exciting after her miserable and hard years. Philip had been out of the town for a few days, hence the meeting between him and Maggie could not materialize. Stephen, in the meanwhile, shows great attention to Maggie, even though not lessening his attention to Lucy. Maggie feels ill at ease. There is a natural desire to succumb to Stephen's charm. One evening, Stephen comes to the dean's house when Lucy is not at home. He tells Maggie, who is embarrassed at the situation, that Philip has returned. When leaving, Stephen suggests that Maggie might come for a stroll in the garden. She takes his arm as they walk, and his firm support is soothing to her. However, she is upset at the situation and returns to the house and cries, wishing for the quiet days with Philip in the Red Deeps. Stephen goes home trying to fight his mad love for Maggie, which is rapidly growing. Maggie is falling under the spell of Stephen's charm, but she is fully conscious that she is doing wrong to Philip and Lucy. And of course, this situation is bound to lead to disaster. Both Stephen and Philip urged her to marry them without the knowledge of each other's aims. Certainly, Lucy did not suspect Stephen's indifference to her. One day, Stephen took Maggie boating and tried to convince her to run away with him and be married. She refused this offer. Maggie refuses to go any further with him and says that he has taken advantage of her. Maggie realizes that they are much beyond the place where they intended to land and return to home. Stephen declares that they would go back and he would take all the blame upon himself. Maggie now feels that she has been too harsh. She lets the situation take its course. The boat drifts on. Eventually, they sight a passing Dutch vessel. Stephen hails the ship and he and Maggie are taken aboard. Maggie thinks that it is too late to do anything but wait for tomorrow. She, of course, has a fear of society because we must understand that she is living in a Victorian society which was bound to make blames on a female like her. And there were the restrictions in such a society. Among all these entangled thoughts, Maggie falls asleep on the ship with a strong feeling that the next day must bring back the old life of struggle. But when she returned and attempted to explain to Lucy and the others what had happened, Maggie dared the wrath and judgment of her relatives and everybody else in the society. But to her bad luck, they refused to listen to her. Tom, her brother, turned her away from the mill, never wished to see her again. Mrs. Tulliver resolved to go with Maggie. After all, she was the mother, and Bob Jekin took them in. Maggie slowly realized that people one by one has deserted her. She wondered if there could be love for her without pain for others. George Eliot's account of society's reaction to Maggie's return is realistic in its satire. Mrs. Glegg surprises everyone by supporting Maggie in her misfortune. She sends Maggie a message offering shelter, but Maggie refuses to see anyone except Dr. Ken. Dr. Ken is a very reputed man of the town, and he is a doctor, and everybody respects him. Philip, on the other hand, writes her saying that he has understood all her actions and exonerates her completely. He states his desire to serve her if she wants his help anytime. It makes Maggie cry out in anguish that no happiness can make her forget the pain of those who loved her. Maggie's pain increased when, in popular female opinion, Maggie is almost a fallen woman. Dr. Ken finally employs her as a governess to his own children. Maggie welcomes the chance and accepts it, but Dr. Ken's kindly action creates trouble for him. Society puts its own construction on the matter and gossips that Dr. Ken intends to marry Maggie. Dr. Ken is forced to break off his connections with Maggie to protect his reputation. Society's ways are once again satirized in this chapter. Even Dr. Ken has to ultimately yield to society's pressure and gossip. Time passes swiftly, and that autumn a terrible flood ravaged St. Ogg's. Knowing that Tom was at the mill, Maggie attempted to reach him in a boat. She was worried about her brother. Although her brother had loved her, she goes to rescue her brother. When Tom sees his sister coming in the boat to protect him, he is overpowered by Maggie's love. He realizes her innate goodness and strength of purpose. To her intense happiness, Tom calls Maggie by his old pet name for her, Maxie. In the early morning, they see huge pieces of wooden machinery floating down towards them. They can do little to get out of the way. Their boat is swamped. Tom, who has dropped his oars, claps Maggie and they go down together. Later, their bodies are found still in a close embrace. 5 years have passed. Little sign of the havoc caused by the flood remains. All the characters living at the time of flood are still alive, except Tom and Maggie. Close to the grave of Mr. Tulliver, a tomb has been erected for the burial of the two bodies of Tom and Maggie. On the tombstone is the inscription, "In their death, they were not divided." Two men visited the tomb now and then. Stephen came in the company of Lucy, but Philip always alone. Philip spends a lot of time among the trees of Red Deeps, remembering Maggie. It is significant that Tom and Maggie, unable to get on together in life, lay undivided in death. Indeed, death brought them together. And finally, Maggie's great love and her self-sacrifice stands out amidst the grief and pain. Two men traveling in a train, and the center of their conversation was a beautiful young woman who had a pair of blue eyes. They were claiming their love for that woman, and surprisingly enough, they were unaware that in the same train the dead body of that very blue-eyed woman was being carried. Hello and assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to my channel, and I am Mehreen. Today I have come here with a very emotional and old story of a woman whose name is Alfred Swancoat. She's a young, beautiful and talented woman living in a small village in 19th century England. This is a very beautiful novel written by Thomas Hardy, and the name of the novel is A Pair of Blue Eyes. The story revolves around Alfred's relationships with two men, Stephen Smith, a young architect, and Henry Knight, a wealthy and educated gentleman. Alfred is the daughter of a clergyman. She meets Stephen, who is working on a restoration project at her father's church. This meeting leaves an immediate effect on Alfred, and she falls in love with Stephen. They fall in love with each other, and this was not a surprising thing because Alfred, who was such a beautiful woman, she had a pair of blue eyes which could attract anyone. But there was a big hurdle between these two persons. There was a big hurdle of social differences between the two families. Secondly, Alfred's father knew a lot about Stephen. He knew that Stephen had a bad temper. Alfred's father, Mr. Swancoat, rejected Stephen Smith as her suitor. Because of his lower social class, Stephen was a young architect of humble origins, whereas the Swancoats were a family of higher social standings. Mr. Swancoat wanted Alfred to marry someone of equal or higher social status, and he considered Stephen to be beneath her. Mr. Swancoat also disapproved of Stephen's habit of being a self-made man and his lack of family connections and social standings. However, it is also mentioned that Stephen had a habit of drinking, which was another reason for Mr. Swancoat's disapproval. So, how a father could think that guy as a perfect match for her beautiful daughter? That is why Stephen gets a big no from Alfred's father. While Alfred was torn between the relationship of her father and her lover Stephen, another man enters the story. This is Henry Knight. You may call him a Shehri Babu coming all the way from the Sheher for a gaon ki gori. Henry Knight is a scholarly and somewhat reserved young man who is basically a friend of Stephen Smith. He is a critic and reviewer and is known for his rather harsh and exacting standards. Henry Knight comes to the village to research the history of parish and to write an article about it. Parish means a small village or town which has its own church and parsley. He basically researches about the church, castles and parishes, and we all know that Alfred is the daughter of a clergyman who works in a church. So it was an obvious thing that both of them will definitely meet in the future, because Mr. Henry Knight has come here to meet his father to research about the parish and the church. Henry Knight is a gentleman of independent means and comes from a family of higher social standings. That is why this was an obvious thing that Mr. Swancoat just clicked his personality and he definitely started to like him. When Henry Knight arrives in the village, Alfred is immediately drawn to his sophistication and wealth. As she spends more time with Henry, she begins to question her feelings for Stephen. Meanwhile, Henry's own past and secrets threatened to destroy his relationship with Alfred. Now the question arises, what was Henry Knight's past? The worst thing about Henry Knight's past is his seduction and abandonment of a woman, which resulted in her death. This dark secret haunts him throughout the novel and has a significant impact on his relationships and personal growth. The death of the woman Henry Knight seduced and abandoned occurred before he met Alfred Swancourt in the novel. This past event is a significant part of Henry's backstory and contributes to his complex and somewhat troubled character. But it is also an ultimate reality that Alfred and Henry have fallen in love for each other from head to toe. As Alfred navigates her relationships with Stephen and Henry, she must also contend with her own desires and sense of identity. She is torn between her love for Stephen, who represents a simpler, more rustic way of life, and her attraction to Henry, who embodies the sophistication and culture she longs for. And during this relationship, they have many secret meetings at Beanie Cliff. Yes, Henry had suggested meeting Alfred at Beanie Cliff, and she agreed. This secret meeting marks the beginning of their illicit romance. I always find nature and destiny very cruel to all the characters in Hardy's novels, whether this is Tess or Eustacia Fry or even Alfred Swancourt. Destiny is always hard upon them. Now, as both of them have fallen in love with each other, and it seems that they will have a very happy ending, but unfortunately there is another twist in the story. The past affair of Stephen Smith and Alfred Swancourt comes into the knowledge of Mr. Henry. After this acknowledgement, Alfred finds herself ashamed and she finds herself unworthy for the love of Mr. Henry. But there is still another turn in the story. Alfred rejected Henry Knight because he had discovered her past indiscretion with Stephen Smith, and she felt ashamed and unworthy of him. And then she makes another decision. Alfred agrees to marry Lord Luxellian due to her father's wishes and to escape the shame and gossip surrounding her past relationships. In the start of the story, I have told you that Henry and Stephen Smith both were traveling in the train because they were both going to Cornwall to attend the marriage ceremony of Alfred. Alfred marries Lord Luxellian due to social pressure and the material security, as he is wealthy and offers a higher social status. Before marrying Lord Luxellian, Alfred plans a final meeting with Henry Knight on the same cliff, Blenny. On such a stormy night, Alfred goes to meet Henry, in fact to return some literary papers which belong to Henry Knight. But unfortunately, she attempts to climb down a steep and treacherous cliff to meet Henry, and Henry is waiting below. But tragically, Alfred loses her footing and falls to her death on the rocks below. The scene is described in vivid and poignant detail by Hardy, emphasizing the senseless tragedy of Alfred's demise. Henry Knight kept on waiting on the same cliff, but Alfred never reaches there. After Alfred's fall from the cliff, her body is washed ashore by the tides. Meanwhile, Henry Knight, who had been waiting for Alfred at the bottom of the cliff, he thinks that Alfred never arrived there, so he kept on waiting, and after all, he went away. When the train arrives at Cromwell, Henry Knight and Stephen Smith both see a coffin on the platform which was carried by some of the passengers. When they ask about the coffin, they were told that this coffin, this dead body, was being carried to the native place, Cromwell, and this dead body was, of course, that was of Alfred. Alfred Swancourt, who had pale blue eyes and who had been the beloved, the most loved person by both of them. I hope you will have liked the story. Definitely I will come up with something new in my next videos. So keep waiting, keep subscribing, and keep supporting my channel. Thanks for being with Mehreen.